The wellness industry draws on cultures and practices from around the world. Does it do a good enough job of acknowledging those origins? Or does it have what's sometimes called a whitewashing problem? With us to consider that, in Cambridge, Ontario, wellness marketing consultant Katie Costa. In Hamilton, Ontario, Robin Lacambra, founder and owner of Good Body Feel, a studio that offers yoga, Pilates, and cardio classes. And in Scarborough, my hometown, in the provincial capital, Rebecca Price, co-founder of the Well Collective, a community dedicated to decolonizing wellness, and a Nike global trainer. Hi to you all.
Hello.
Hi.
So a slight confession, Scarborough's not my hometown. London, Ontario is, but I've been in Scarborough for 5 minutes and I'm claiming it for my own. I'm very happy to have you all on the program. Robin, I wanted to start with you. How would you define wellness culture?
Well, wellness practices are practices that tend to the various aspects of our human well-being. So it might be emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual, whether that's non-denominational spirituality or religious-based spirituality. And wellness culture is this interesting thing that's forever in flux. But what it looks like currently is this tension between folks who have popularized wellness practices with origins that are often from countries, racialized countries, or indigenous practices, brown and black practices, and then the tension of folks who are trying to come back and reclaim these practices as their own.
Tension, that's a big word. Can you go more into that? How does that tension play out?
This tension plays out around who profits, who benefits, who gets to call themselves a leader, an expert, a guru, and then this pushback around the calling in and the desire to recognize and decolonize practices that are often from cultures of origin or co-opted by people who aren't originally from that culture of origin. And this like fragility and defensiveness of, oh, but I'm really good at this and it really serves me and it's really serving the community that I've created. So this tension around these beautiful practices that really do serve to individual and collective well-being, but who benefits from what leader, where do the profits flow, this sort of thing.
We're going to get into some of the things that you brought up. The wellness industry is a billion-dollar industry. Katie, what sectors fall under the wellness economy umbrella?
Yeah, well, I really believe in the 7 prongs of wellness. And so spiritual, physical, mental, intellectual, all of these sectors fall under that economy, including, I think I mentioned social and occupational. So anything that involves someone's well-being, their job, their livelihood, their health and wellness, that falls under the wellness economy.
And do we know how much that economy is worth?
There's lots of projections and it changes every single day. But as per Forbes in 2019, they did project that by the end of 2022, it would be worth more than $77 billion.
That's a lot of money. Rebecca, who does this leave behind?
Going back to what Robin had touched on earlier, and that whole entire piece around reclaiming practices that are indigenous or practices that come and stem from racialized communities. For the most part, when we think about wellness, I don't know about you, Nan, but for a very long time, I was the only person of color, the only Black woman in my yoga practices and in yoga studios and spaces and a lot of wellness spaces beyond just yoga. And so for me, when I look at it, it's typically and historically racialized people and other people who occupy spaces of marginality that are excluded from wellness spaces as well as wellness practices. So it's not just the actual space, but then the idea of being able to see themselves reflected back in practice too as well, which doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in a physical space to be able to embody that. But what ends up happening is that people also then are just excluded from all practices and all facets of what that wellness, like all facets of what wellness looks like and can be, or how it's processed at a individual and a collective community level too as well.
Rebecca, you mentioned that you would be taking yoga classes and you were the only person that looked like you. Did you feel like you didn't belong, or did you feel, were you not welcomed by the people in that space?
For a very long time, I was the only woman of color, the only Black person. I've been practicing yoga for 20 years, over 20 years. And for a large part of that time, that's just how I was felt. I was felt like I wasn't welcomed. I've, been in spaces where people have, like, I've come into the space and people have moved their mats. I have been, like, one time I went to meet a friend who was white at a yoga space, and we were actually having a meeting because I'm a part of their advisory committee for this yoga program that they run. And like this whole entire idea of me like stealing a mat, like I brought my own mat, but then there was this whole entire conversation around that. And then like, when when I founded like I Rise Yoga and Wellness, like I had reached out to a bunch of yoga studios and wellness spaces in the city. And none of them got back to me except for one. And I was just like, hey, I have like 20 women of color. We want to practice yoga and I just need a space to rent. Like, can I rent your space? And nobody got back to me. One person did, and they just me like, how did you get 20 women of color to want to join you in practice? So it wasn't even about like, hey, congratulations, this is really cool. I want to be a part of this. Like, these are our hourly rental rates. It was like, why and how, right? And then I'm like, don't ask me why or how, just understand. And so then that's kind of like where I shifted that narrative of like, well, I'm tired of being the only person of color. And then that's how I just decided to go off and like do my own thing because I mean, I'm very, articulate and I'm very sound and secure in who I am. But then there's other people who may not be able to be in that position. I also have the privilege of being able to afford to be able to go into these studio spaces and pay for these classes and things like that. And the communities that I work with predominantly might not be in that same position to be able to do that. And so, like, really looking at what that meant at a community level and how important it was, especially for the communities that I work with who are historically disenfranchised and marginalized, how important it was for them to be able to access wellness tools and modalities to be able to support their overall wellness. So, it's been a journey.
Because I'm really sorry that happened to you because I think some people might be watching this and listening to this and think, you're trying to better yourself. You're trying to take care of your body. You're trying to take care of your mind. And they might not understand why you might experience those barriers. What are some of the barriers that you noticed exist within the wellness community for racialized people, Rebecca?
So, I mean, and also Robin, you can probably talk to this a little bit too as well. Some of the barriers, there are a lot. So if we're even thinking about like accessibility, and sometimes people think accessibility like offering sliding scale like classes, but accessibility also looks like where is your studio located? How can I get there? I need public transportation. Is this located in a community that feels safe for me as someone who's Black, right? And like going to a studio that's in like, I don't know, Rosedale, for instance, like, I've had lots of traumatic experiences walking the streets of the city being a Black woman. And, and what does that mean? So like even thinking about accessibility and like how safe of a space is it just to be able to get to? Then we're thinking about accessibility around like how safe is my space to be in, right? Like, so when we're looking at like, do you have any policies and procedures to kind of help me as someone who occupies a positionality of like, marginalization, when we're thinking about like how trauma responsive are our offerings and things like that. We're thinking about like cost. We're thinking about like even like, sometimes we have a tendency in the wellness industry to be cultural tourists, right? So like, you have like this hip hop yoga class, and then, I'm the only person of color there, and you're listening to like Jay-Z and Drake and all this kind of stuff, and you're like, yeah. But then at the same time, you're not really thinking about the context and the cultural implications, because it's really nice to navigate through my community without even honoring and acknowledging the fact that like you're, being a tourist, right?
I just wanted to bring in Robin on that. When you do talk about the barriers that do exist within the wellness community for racialized people, Robin, what do you see?
Uh, Everything that Rebecca said, and representation is one too. Like I'm originally from Toronto and I moved to Hamilton in 2016. And when I first landed here, I was looking up studio spaces and communities that I could potentially join. And when I looked at all of the Instagrams, no one looked like me in on their feeds. Everyone was thin and white. And so immediately I felt like, okay, I have to have this armor on because I don't know how I'll be received in this space. I don't know what like ignorance that will potentially trigger me and then take me out of my body, which is the reason why I would want to be coming to that space anyways, to be embodied and to be mindful. But to enter these spaces really wound up in this protection mode for fear of being triggered in these predominantly white spaces is a barrier. So representation is one, and that also shows that there is an appreciation and a respect for the leadership and the talent and the capabilities of folks who are made to be racialized and made to be marginalized. So if everyone on the teaching staff looks like a certain way, that already implies that there's this clique culture at play, and clique culture is a barrier to feeling like you belong. And if you don't feel like you belong, how are you supposed to feel well in that space?
Katie, Robin brought up, oh, sorry, go ahead, Robin. Yep.
Oh, and I was going to say there have been, like, when Rebecca was talking to, is the space safe to be in? It made me think of an instance where I brought up that I felt like I was experiencing racism in a space, in a yoga space. And the response was, how do you know it was about race? And that question always gets me, because in a racialized body, it is always about race. Like in a culture where racism has been constructed, fortified, and upheld, it is always about race. So that kind of ignorance and lack of awareness around cultural sensitivity and how to hold space for racial trauma or trauma around any sort of marginalization, that needs to be at the center of these wellness spaces for them to be truly safer, braver spaces where people feel like they can come in and belong. And it's that feeling of belonging that creates greater access.
And Katie, I wanted to just build on what Robin was saying. She mentioned Instagram. When you do go to a yoga space or Pilates space, in person, you're around other people. But social media is a place that a lot of people have relied on for the past 2 years just to get us out of this funk, just to help us get through the pandemic. Do social algorithms favor white wellness creators?
Yeah, this is a big conversation as well, because there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to social media and how these algorithms truly work. There's a lot of suspicion, and the Instagram experts or other social media experts do kind of pull together these hypotheses. So I just want to say that nothing I'm about to say has actually been confirmed by Meta, Facebook, or Instagram. However, based on the experiences of both white and Black creators, I do believe that the algorithms do favor white wellness creators. And as I said, I don't think that the algorithms were designed to be racist. However, we
The
do
people
know.
programming them, maybe?
Well, honestly, I think it's more our inherent biases as humans, because the way these algorithms work is it shows you more of what you want to see, and how Instagram decides that is based on what you engage with. And you start to see how a positive kind of feedback loop starts to come in play, where these white wellness creators are maybe more positively received, which does have to do with race, and therefore they get more engagement, which helps them get more visibility, and they get in front of more accounts, which then leads to more engagement and then favors them in the algorithm because they're getting this engagement. And there have been trends between white and black creators that show that it's easier for a white creator to go viral. And more virality, again, leads to more views, which leads to more followers and ultimately more opportunity, not only for business owners, but influencers or just anyone posting on social media, any white wellness creators, right? They can get paid from brands or access, right? Access to these programs and services that they could otherwise pay for. They could still pay for, but they're then getting gifted or paid to do these things and participate. So yeah, I'm kind of going off of the original question here, but
But
long
to add
story
on to
short,
what Kate
Well, I know for social media on Instagram, there's been conversations around shadow banning and around certain influencers getting paid more. And there's been data that shows that white creators get paid more than BIPOC creators. Beyond social media, Rebecca was mentioning when she did try to organize something and the resistance and the microaggressions that she experienced. Katie, beyond social media, why is it harder for BIPOC people to start and build wellness-related businesses?
Another multifaceted question. I think Rebecca said it well that, it's always about race. I think there's so much subconscious bias that white people have, that a lot of people just aren't ready to look at or even acknowledge. And I know I'm not going to get everything in this conversation perfect, but I'm here anyways because I think it's important to start these conversations and not be afraid to look at your own biases and acknowledge them, like we all have them. And because of that, the businesses that you choose to support, race does come into that if you are not acknowledging and unpacking your own internal biases. That's number one. Number two, there is huge pay gaps. Like, we are familiar with the pay gap between men and women. There's a huge pay gap between Black women and white women. Actually, on average, according to Forbes as well, Black women are paid 21% less than white women to do the same work with the same credentials. And so, like someone like myself, where I was blessed to start my business while at a full-time job, and I had that income coming in, that helped me start and grow my business. If Black women specifically, are getting paid so much less, there's that much less disposable income that can be put into growing their businesses. So access to resources before even loans come into play, because we know that it's easier for white people to qualify for loans and business loans, mortgages, than Black folks, especially if they have ethnic names, any BIPOC individual, I want to say. So there's definitely multiple things at play beyond social media, but the racism at play in the social media algorithms also makes it harder for people to gain virality, gain reach, which leads to more sales. And like I said, more social power, which leads to economic power because of the day and age that we're in. Like, social media is so prominent. So yeah, if Rebecca,
But I also think that, just to add on here, I mean, it's also like you can check your biases by simply, doing an audit of who you follow, right? So, like, a simple thing is that, like, again, going back to what Robin had said before and what I had acknowledged before too as well, is like, who are you positioning as the experts, right? And so then if you're constantly only following a certain aesthetic or a certain person that looks like you're not really inherently challenging your biases, right? And what does that look like, right? And so I've had yoga studios that have called me, and they've been, all of a sudden they had this big epiphany, especially after like the whole summer of George Floyd, like, oh my God, like, I never noticed that all my staff are white. Like, how could you not notice? You live in the city of Toronto, which is 53% diverse. Like, come on, like, you know what I mean? But again, going back to Katie's point, if you're inherently biased and leaning towards a certain kind of look, a certain kind of feel, it's easy to gaslight your way through like not wanting to hold space for acknowledging the fact that I have a tendency to lean into this direction because maybe I'm concerned about my safety. Maybe I'm concerned. Maybe I just don't feel like these people belong. Like, I'm not even like honing into the fact, like, where do these cultural practices and spiritual practices or wellness practices that I'm implementing and offering and making people pay for, where are they coming from? And so why don't the people who are offering it look like the people who invented it, right? Like, it's a simple kind of like 1 + 1 = 2. Right.
Well, no one like that, even in that space. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
But like, that's a good test of like, look around you, outside the people who work for you to the people who even come into your business. Do you have anyone who doesn't look like you even interacting with your business online or in real life?
And
That's a good.
and there's also the question of I know we've been having this conversation for the past few years over appropriation versus appreciation. Rebecca, earlier you mentioned being in the studio and they're playing hip hop music. Robin, when we talk about these wellness practices that originate from different countries, what people's culture have you seen appropriated for the purpose of wellness?
Oh, like all of them. And I recognize that there's a level of cultural appropriation that can't really be avoided now in the global world that we're in. Like we have such ready access to all sorts of different cultures thanks to the internet, and whatever else. And then when these really life-changing practices somehow make their way into one sphere, it's there's this like real yearning to be part of it and to share it because it changed your life and you want to help change other people's lives, or like eating a life-changing taco, so now you want to make your own chorizo taco in southern Ontario or whatever. And there is a beauty in that, like, oh wow, I discovered something so beautiful and I want to share this beautiful thing with other people. And so there's a level of that one I get and two can't be avoided. So then the question becomes, who benefits from me sharing this and who loses out, and how can I close the gap so that the culture of origin is recognized as the source and somehow benefits, whether it's benefits from awareness, from my advocacy, or from profit sharing. Like if I own a yoga studio and I have the ability to share X% of my profits to X cultural center. So finding those ways of closing the loop or creating these bridges of reciprocity, that this culture that's giving me something so beautiful, how can I help spread it in a way that's rooted in integrity? But the where we go wrong is, it's not like the whitewashing of wellness isn't so rooted in that kind of integrity, but it's rooted in colonialism, like this entitlement, like, oh, I'm going to take this. I discovered it and I'm going to bring it to North America, or I'm going to bring it to my town, and I'm the leader of it. And so there's this entitlement and this taking and this continued colonization of brown people, brown and black and indigenous people, and without the thinking of how can I amplify the culture of origin, how can I help support the culture of origin or folks from the culture of origin or whatever it is. It's this continued loop of colonization, and that's because with colonization, even white people lose. That's the sad thing. Like, with colonization and the creation of race, pre-colonization, all countries, all cultures had rich practices that were spiritual and ritualistic and what have you, and they were full of holistic wellness. But because of colonization and because of the colonial types of education that erase culture, it makes, I will be blunt, it makes white people hungry for something more than their whiteness. And then folks that aren't white, our cultures are the ones that end up being extorted and exploited.
I also think that the fact that all these different practices are practiced by so many different people now, because again, at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about the wellness industry. It's about taking care of your mind and your body. But we're at the point where we're having a debate over appropriation and appreciation. Rebecca, how can we appreciate other people's culture through wellness without participating in appropriation?
And I just want to hold space for an understanding that when we're thinking about the appreciation part, we also need to hold space for the storied legacy, the historical legacy and significance of what some of these practices have been for the original cultures and peoples that created them. So when we're thinking about like we're saging, when we're thinking about hoodoo and people not all of a sudden it's fun to practice juju and all that kind of stuff, like people were killed for that. People were enslaved for that. People were put in residential schools. Like, so the same practices that we are taking in the and putting in these wellness spaces, like ancestors died practicing these practices. Like colonialism rewrote history in a way that made you feel bad for your very own existence and for the very culture of which you belong. So like I really also think that when we're thinking about like appreciation and appropriation, like we also have to hold space for that understanding of the significance of the cultural and historical legacies and implications of what that has meant for peoples, right? And so when we're thinking about like appropriation and appreciation, it's one thing to like, you know, say like I respect and hold space and share space, and you can think of different ways that you can be able to honor that and acknowledge the historical context and legacy of it, and then also, you know, just acknowledge by appreciation, saying this is something that I feel like has benefited me, and like then look at the ways in which you can kind of like decolonize your practice so that it's more authentic to who you are, speaks more authentic to who you are as a person, and your culture, and then kind of like meld and put that all together. And I think that, you know, globalization is a thing, it's real, like it is what it is, right? But at the same time, like, you know, you can do things in a way that's respectful, right? In a way that really garners and holds space and acknowledges. I think what people tend to do and what makes appropriation so easy is because it abdicates people of any responsibility of acknowledging the harm that they've caused, right?
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I think, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and we've just barely scratched the top of this discussion. We really do hope that maybe we can pick it up at a different time. We do thank you all for your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.